Hello, everybody. I am Dr. Ellie Anderson, co-host of Overthink podcast and YouTube channel. I am delighted to be here today with my guest, Anastasia Berg. Anastasia is an assistant professor of philosophy at UC Irvine, as well as the editor of The Point magazine. And she is co-author with Rachel Wiseman of the book, What Are Children For? On Ambivalence and Choice. Welcome, Anastasia.
Thank you so much for having me.
I have been wanting to have this conversation for a long time because I feel like this book was written for me. And that's, I think, something that you talk about. Like, you and Rachel wrote this book. You are both, you both have philosophical backgrounds. And you wanted to bring a philosophical angle to this question of whether or not to have children. I think this is something that a lot of people in our generation struggle with, probably the younger generations in an age of climate crisis that is only looking to get worse over time, in an age where there's there are so few social resources for people, especially in America, in an age where we're learning more and more about the continuing gender gaps that exist between men and women in terms of childcare. It's like front of mind for many people, the question of whether or not to have children. So tell us about your view on this. Like, what are children for? If you want to say a little bit about how you and Rachel came to write this book together too, feel free to go into that.
So the book came out of conversations that Rachel and I started having when we were in our late 20s, early 30s. And we felt that as people who were literary minded, philosophically minded, intellectually kind of inclined, we felt there was a real gap in kind of what kind of texts were available for us to think with. Mm-hmm. So there were kinds of novels and fiction. It's a genre we talk a lot about in the book, the motherhood ambivalence novels.
Yeah.
And they were very useful in dramatizing a kind of uncertainty and indeed ambivalence around the choice of having a child, the early experiences of having a child. But there was a way in which they almost put that ambivalence as like a goal, as the sophisticated position for a woman that could be liberating in some ways. It can certainly not a guide for how to overcome that ambivalence when you want to. So that was a kind of one thing, a very subjective narrative that we found. And another kind of large swaths of literature was just what we would call sort of causal third person explanations, where declining birth rates are just correlated with everything that's going on.
Yeah.
So everything from the rise in women's education to climate crisis to declining sperm counts to, whatever you can think of, you have it as an answer. But that it was very hard for us to find ourselves as one sort of data point on all these plot lines. So we thought, what would be the kind of thing that would help people think through this question, and went out and tried to write that. And we realized that we need to do two things before we kind of answer the, so what are children for question. We had to confront and think through very seriously, by taking seriously, the concerns that people are experiencing that are keeping them from engaging in this question, perhaps in that ultimate philosophical register. And that's everything from the difficulty of reconciling a prospect of children with material success, financial stability, professional achievement, to the kind of the dating and kind of romantic patterns that are defining life for people of our generation, and the way they oftentimes are cross purposes with the goals of starting a family. That also includes specifically ethical but feminist concerns. So how to reconcile the ambitions of women who want to have autonomy over their lives and bodies, who want to go out and accomplish things on a par with men. Can children fit into that project? And then finally answering that question in that high philosophical register, which really just means asking the question of the value of human life.
Yeah.
And so we felt like you have to take people through that dialectic in order to then address the hardest concerns, which today we think we call them the argument from evil and the argument from suffering, which is to say, these are the worries that human life is either so full of challenge, pain, loss, and grief that it would be unjustified to bring other people into the world. That's definitely a concern that climate change brings to the fore, but it also brings to the fore what we call the argument from evil, which is the thought that we either cause so much damage or we are so voracious and selfish that it would just be wrong to bring more of us into the world. So you look around, you go, human life is what brought us into this mess. Who wants more of it?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And you come to the conclusion that, like, neither of those arguments is sufficient for suggesting that we should not have children. And so I think we're at an interesting moment right now because, as you just alluded to, you tackle the movement of anti-natalism or some of the arguments for anti-natalism, including most famously by the philosopher David Benatar in the book. But I think we're also, and even since the publication in 2024, because we're recording this interview in early 2025, there's been a real mainstreamification of pro-natalism. I mean, you're seeing that with the current political administration. I mean, J.D. Vance is a huge proponent of pro-natalism. This idea that we have an obligation to have children, who we is obviously a fraught question. But I guess I'm curious, especially since you kind of put yourselves on the line in this book too, and you and your co-author both sort of started from a position of ambivalence and then both ended up having children, and you talk about that a little bit in your sort of more personal moments of the book. How do you feel about this? I don't know. How do you feel about this idea among pro-natalists that there is an obligation to have children? I take it that's not your view, but I have heard, I'm forgetting where it was, but I heard on at least one podcast, your book grouped in a pro-natalist category. And I didn't feel like that was necessarily fair, but I guess I would ask, like, what is your relationship with pro-natalism, as the author of this book?
Yeah. So we like the following shorthand. We say we're anti-anti-natalists.
Yeah.
Which is to say, we do think that the kind of anti-natalist, both arguments and sentiments, are ones that ultimately fall short. And a lot of times also betray a kind of anti-humanist and nihilist attitude that I think is ethically suspect. But as the word pro-natalism is used today, which is to say a very direct concern with the birth rate and going along with this, some kind of presumption that individuals have a duty, possibly all individuals have a duty, and when we say individuals,
probably
women, to have a child, that's where we definitely, this is not our concern. Our concern has always been with helping people navigate a really difficult question that we think the various kinds of confusions and narratives and paradigms in our, and when I say our, I do mean kind of liberal and progressive circles, have made it hard to navigate. So to make it clear, we don't think anyone in particular has a duty to have children. We do, where we end up in the book, is affirming a possibility of saying yes to human life, of recognizing that we think, most of us in our position to see that we think a human future is still something that's worth fighting for. It's still something that's worth investing in. I think most of us are already committed to it. That does mean that somebody's going to have children. It doesn't mean that your or my contribution to that project of a flourishing, robust human future needs to be biological motherhood.
Right.
It could be non-biological parenting, but it could also be being a great aunt or being a great godparent. It could be being a brilliant philosopher who's helping raise the next generation by giving them an intellectual and ethical upbringing. It could be being a journalist. It could be being a politician. We can't forget that there will be no work for politicians and journalists and professors if there was no human future, period. So that's something that's special about having biological children. It is not the case that any one of us in particular needs to be doing that role as opposed to another one. And beyond what I just said, which is there's a kind of conditioned relationship, I don't think having a biological child is therefore somehow more important or more worthy or more difficult. I do think that if you are in all these other ways in your life invested in the possibility of a human future, but you're an anti-natalist, you might be standing in a kind of practical, ethical contradiction with yourself. So that's where we stand on that. I will add one more thing, which is some of the most rewarding responses to the book that we've gotten. And of course, there have been people who said, it helped me think through this question myself and embrace the choice to have kids. It helped me talk to my partner. We get a lot of that. That's amazing, because part of the problem that we identify is that we don't know how to talk about it. It's become taboo and so fraught. We don't talk about it, not with ourselves, not with our friends, not with our partners, going into a relationship 2-3 years before we raise it. But in addition to those, it's been so rewarding to have people say, it reconciled me to the possibility of not having children. And that's whether or not it's by choice or not. So people who said, I'm struggling with fertility, but reading your book and seeing that what's at stake is not just the shape of my own life, but it is also this possibility of a human future. And I can see that even if I can't participate in this particular way, I can still do so meaningfully in all these other ways. Yeah. That gives me, that buoys me, that gives me comfort. And the fact that you're willing to affirm that we can embrace, as people on the left, embrace the possibility of raising children, that also gives me the permission to grieve.
Yeah.
So that's one kind of response. And then another, again, in the same category, we've had very memorable response of somebody writing saying, you know, I thought I wanted to have children. My partner does not. And that was a source of conflict. But I now see, because of your book, that I can work through that in our relationship, and I can embrace the role of an uncle. And I can imagine my life without children in a way I couldn't before. So to me, that's the greatest testament, and it's the greatest answer to this question of you pro-natalists, and saying, well, people who are deciding not to have kids are feeling seen and talked to by this book. I assume they could not say this about a pro-natalist tract.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really appreciate that you bring in this point that those of us who don't have biological children are in many ways often still contributing to the betterment of future generations. I mean, one thing I've been thinking about that a lot lately, because, you know, full disclosure, part of the reason I was so excited about reading this book is because this is a question I think about every single day. Like deciding whether or not to have children at this point in my life is a constant question for me. And I think one thing that I do think about is the fact that I'm able to be of service to my community in a way that I wouldn't be at this point if I had children. Recently, I mentioned we're recording this in early 2025. There were recently some huge fires in Los Angeles where I live. And one of the things that I was able to do, because I don't have children, is volunteer with kids who were displaced. And my friends who have young children, I mean, they have so many other things going on. Like, they don't have that free time to go volunteer. And so that's and I don't fault them for that at all. Like, of course, they have those obligations. And so I think that's a form of just, like, we're all contributing in different ways. And we occasionally, as you can probably imagine, on YouTube get extraordinarily sexist comments. I just deleted one yesterday that, actually, maybe I think I might have left it up just for fun, that was like, such a shame she doesn't have children or something. And I was like, you know what, if I did, you wouldn't be watching this video. So maybe you can thank me for not having children. And so I feel like those kinds of trade-offs that we have to make, it's not a question about whether it's like right or wrong to have children. I'm an anti-anti-natalist as well. We did an anti-natalism episode a while back, and I just don't find the anti-natalist arguments compelling. And you offered some good reasons why they aren't here, along with Wiseman in your book. But I feel like when we're talking about those negotiations of who it's right for and why, we need to be taking those broader community factors into account. I mean, as well, of course, as you mentioned, this is sort of targeted often towards a liberal and progressive audience. The fact that to choose whether or not to have children is an immense privilege anyway, right? And I would say, I think it probably, I think having read your book, I can say with confidence that both of us really would seek a future where that question is something that more people, especially women, have autonomy over. Like, they have that kind of freedom to question for themselves.
I'll say, not to make your deliberations any harder.
Yeah. No, please. I was hoping for an answer in this book, and I was still uncertain.
I know. I know. We don't tell you what to do.
Yeah.
We do hope to perhaps, as we say, kind of liberate you to make a somewhat more authentic choice. So liberate you from some of the things that might be on one's mind and that don't have to be. But beyond that it's your life and you have to direct it as you see fit. But I will say one thing about this question of how do we divide attention and our work and our investment. And I think that if you have a small child, you can't, and they need your care at that moment, and you can't volunteer. That is all true. But I also think we do have to remember, and it's something we do try in some way to also kind of remind people in the book, is that it is very easy, I think, in our collective imagination, also for me, to equate parenting with the parenting of small children. So when we look at the genre of the motherhood ambivalence novels, they're not mothers to children of all ages. They're mothers to children of the first year of life. When we look at representations, which are very welcome from a certain perspective of looking at the absence of certain kind of representations. When we think about the difficulties of having children, we imagine very small children, and we imagine the kind of haggard. I think recently there's Night Bitch was a film that came out. And so it is true that perhaps with a very small child, the trade-offs are one kind. Older children still need your time and attention, but in a different way. Yeah. And one of the things that was very interesting to us, or part of the work that Rachel and I did, was to have both kind of big survey type interviews, so qualitative research is that sort, but also follow-up in-depth interviews with individuals that had every kind of position on this question. Yes, no, maybe, can't decide, etc., regretting. Yeah. And one of the things that was so interesting is actually to hear from older parents, and suddenly you hear something that's just not visible, not even to me, which was how, when they think of parenting, how rewarding it has been. They think about the whole duration of the experience. And someone say the most meaningful bit, it wasn't a sweet baby. It wasn't, I don't know, the first day of school. It was like having adult children. And one of the things in this relation we talk about is that on the one hand, having children has increasingly become one project among many. It's almost we forgot that what's at stake is also this possibility of a human future. So people just think of it as this the kind of thing that I want to do, and I weigh it against the other things I might do. But it's also really felt often and represented often to be as a kind of life-ending project. Like if I take that on, I won't be able to do anything that I care about. Yeah. I won't be able to pursue my other pursuits. And I think that, again, it's something, there's truth to the fact that you take on a huge obligation that's going to take a lot of resources of every kind, time, money, emotion, etc. But it's also the case that there's something misleading about that representation. Partly it's because as we're having children later and later, it's harder to imagine what living an active, fulfilling life at the other end of it. But also even with the timing of when we have children now, they grow up, they leave the home. So, and it's easy to hear that saying parents will never volunteer. And there I do want to say, well, I don't know. I mean, they might volunteer again. They might volunteer 2 years later. They might volunteer in 5 years. They might volunteer in 15 years. They might go and take their kids to volunteer as well. Yeah. So I hope I'm not making the decision any more fraught. But I do want to kind of put that on the table because, and just to put the most general way of putting this point is that I think we've lost the way in which children can be continuous with fulfilling adult human lives. And that's true both within the narrative of a personal life, because of this way in which we think it's like throwing yourself off a cliff. Once I do it, I won't recognize myself. I can't pursue anything I care about. And also because as the way we think about it, increasingly we talk about these distinctions between the people with children, the childless, calling for child-free zones. And even if we're thinking of that call and volunteer effort, how more possible would it be for a young family to have one of its members go perhaps with the older child if we could rely on one another for care, for support, and we just took that kind of things for granted.
Absolutely. Yeah, because I feel like so many times these conversations end up becoming polarized of they're both sides are on the defensive. And I'm happy you bring up the fact that like there is this emphasis on young children, because I think that's what I'm experiencing in my life. Most of my close friends who have children under 5. And so those are the kinds of people that I'm talking about. They also did volunteer in other ways too. Just want to make that clear. It's just that like I was the one who could go on a Saturday morning for 3 hours to be with other people's kids. But I feel like there's this sense, I mean, something I often experience is the joy that I take in the free time that I have, of course. Like, there is nothing that brings me greater joy than reading for 3 hours on a weekend morning, and that would look very different if I had children. However, I've also heard, but I think sometimes I guess I didn't finish out that thought. Sometimes that can become this sort of higher than thou among the childless of like, look at all that I have. And then on the other hand, I've sometimes heard, even from a dear friend of mine who once accused me of childless privilege when she
like that.
was very financially secure, chose to have a child of her own. Like, this was not a coerced situation. And I was like, I don't think it's a privilege anyway, it just didn't track that actual term. But there's it
might not be a helpful contribution to the discourse.
I will say I don't think it is. And something else that came up in that conversation was a sense that, like, you can't understand what love is if you don't have a child.
Oh,
and
yeah.
I'm just like, I would perfectly well grant that it's probably a type of love. I'm sure it is, that I have not experienced. At the same time, I have a lot of very close relationships with children. I've worked with children a lot. Like, I love them. And I've heard from another friend too. It's like, yeah, I feel like you could kind of imagine what that love is. So I feel like one of the things that happens in these conversations is there's this defensiveness that sometimes manifests in this, like, existential, well, I have free time on the one hand versus, like, you literally don't understand what love is on the other because you don't have that experience.
I think the stakes of the question are so high individually, and it's made it so difficult to have productive conversations, especially across a divide of somebody who has children or doesn't have children. And that is, again, a kind of challenge we pick up in the book. I mean, one of the things is that for the duration of composing the book, I think I have a child and Rachel doesn't. And so for us, the ability to have that conversation productively was something we wanted to invite people in. And so is, how do we make people who don't have children not only not have children, but as Rachel hints at, we write personal essay just for the introduction and the conclusion. Rachel writes the introduction, I write the conclusion. And Rachel hints at it. For her, it wasn't obvious that she would have a child. So it wasn't just somebody who just, like, knew that she wanted it and I could hype up the experience for her. And how do we create the possibility of that conversation? That was what we wanted to model in this book. I will say one specific thing about the various kind of FOMO arguments, which I wholeheartedly reject. And I write about it, that I don't want, I mean, I'm not here to call bad faith on anyone. If somebody feels like the relationship they have with their child is completely sui generis, like that's all the power to them. That's fine. But I am saying there is another way of looking at it. And it's the same, I'll say it's an analogy in the way that some people, there's an argument whether or not motherhood is transformative. I take a hard no on this question. If somebody says it's transformative for them, I respect that. But I also want to introduce, and it's really just what you're saying. Like, I want to tell you, Ellie, you're right. I think if you've known real love, then it could be rewarding in all sorts of ways. It's an incredibly intense, intimate relationship that you enter into a person that you bring from zero into adulthood. But if you've known love, you're not going to be like, what's happening now? And I kind of speculate in a little bit of maybe a poetic register. I mean, you know, we learn love through our relationship with our parents. So in a way, every love that we have in our lives is in a metaphorical or otherwise way. In some way that's not unrelated to what it is to know love from our parents. And I think that is why it's not a complete unknown. And I also don't think ultimately it's helpful. It's alienating, this kind of like, you don't even know what you're talking about discourse, but also the idea that having children gives you access to something that's almost like it's like a drug-induced experience. I don't think that's the kind of thing that would help people think through, do I want this or not? I don't think that touches the concern of people. I think it just stokes anxiety. So that's another reason I think to push against what seems like in their kindness they're trying to recommend something wonderful to you, but I don't think that's necessarily helpful. It certainly would have been helpful to me as I navigated that question of how children would or would not fit into my life.
And how are you thinking about this question? I mean, I presume, I can't remember if you mentioned this explicitly in the book or not, but I presume that you started writing this before the overturning of Roe v. Wade at a time when, I mean, I think we were, obviously gender relations have been fraught for as long as I can remember and many, many centuries before. But I feel like there was maybe a little bit more of a moment of optimism, at least on my end, that this question of whether or not to have families would be something that more and more women had the autonomy to consider. And I think post overturning of Roe v. Wade, I'm, you know, obviously just feeling very dismayed about that. And so I guess I'm curious how you're feeling at this juncture where fewer and fewer women are having that choice, and how, like, what that might say about this discourse moving forward.
So to put our cards on the table, both Rachel and I, we're pro-choice, so these kind of developments strike us as kind of a catastrophe. From the standpoint of what we're interested in the book, I also think that we need to have the possibility of separating affirming the importance of now salvaging women's rights. We were writing it at first. I think it was like securing them or protecting them, and then it was like clawing them back.
Yeah.
And not letting those concerns kind of warp our thinking about what the role of children should and shouldn't be when that could be a choice. Yeah. And so one thing that we see is that there are all sorts of kinds of discourse that make it seem it's not even so much that women will directly, and I'm talking about people who are opposing these developments, will necessarily directly decide, I would have had children, I would have had many, I had my life planned out, but guess what? This happened, I'm not going to have kids. What I think happens much more often is that it alienates us from that question. It makes that question something we don't want to think about because it's tainted by this kind of development. And one thing that I think is important to remember is if you are on the left, I think we shouldn't let the right have even more control over reproductive fates by letting those kind of developments force us into choices that are not the ones that we would otherwise embrace.
Okay.
So again, one of the refrains in talking about this book is that what's important to me is not that people have kids, it's that they make choices themselves and don't have those choices made for them.
Yeah.
And if we let the right dictate the conversation about the role of children, which is it's very hard not to.
Yeah.
But if we do
on many points right now.
But if we do that, we can lose the possibility of directing our lives, raising our children the way that we see fit. And I think that would be unfortunate. But it's a really, really hard line to walk, precisely for the reasons that you already been bringing up. How do we affirm the possibility of children in human life while not falling into a pro-natalist, unwelcome position? How do we do so while not making women who choose not to feel less than? How do we do that while making everyone in society, we haven't even talked about this, but part of the problem also is, this is a book, so it's great. We're in video, which we not always are. The book is orange. It's called What Are Children For? The frequency with which it's assumed this is a book about and for women is astounding. The question of whether or not there should be a human future is a human, universal, philosophical, ethical question. If we think we should, there is nothing to suggest that women should be doing this in any way consortedly more than men. For all the things that or people who have children biologically have to put in, there are plenty of opportunities for everyone who's not doing that to contribute in other ways. So there's so many things that are standing in the way of us having productive conversations, which is why we thought we want to just make a little bit more room for a place where we can all breathe easy and ask this question in a way almost by kind of silencing. When I say background noise, I mean, this is the substance of our lives.
Yeah.
But for the sake of making this particular choice, it is sometimes there are ways of thinking about it or what the implications of these questions are: climate change, our success, dating, and things like reproductive rights that could be disruptive to our capacity to make our real good informed choice here.
Yeah. And I think too, one thing we haven't touched on is that this is a work that is written for a public facing audience. Like, you're a philosophy professor, but you and Wiseman are both editors of The Point magazine, which is an amazing online magazine. It's all online, right? I've never gotten it. It's also in print.
It's very much in print. In fact, I was thinking, I was actually thinking, because I got to get to come here and meet you, that I should have brought you a copy.
In print!
It's very much in print.
Oh my gosh, I'm sorry. I'm still online pilled. But yes, it's an amazing
Pride
magazine.
and Joy is our print magazine.
Okay. I learned something new today. Sorry for my ignorance before, but it's an amazing magazine that you guys have all kinds of online events, lots of articles that people can read that are, many of which are written by professional philosophers, but with a public in mind. And so I just want to say that this is really a book that is written for the public. But I want to go back to something that you alluded to in your question before, which is the presumption that this is a question for women. And, there are various reasons for that. One being that women are conditioned, if we're talking about cisgender women and men here, and couples, obviously there's an immense variety of couples here. But I think if we're taking that as a sort of case, women are socially conditioned from a young age to be thinking about these things. There's also the infamous biological clock. There's the fact that based on what we know about the impacts that having children has on women's careers and lives, it is a salient question for them, even more than for men. But at the same time, none of those things mean that in couples that are comprised of a cisgender man and woman, that question should fall on the woman. And in fact, it increases her mental load to have that question fall to her. And so I just want to quickly quote you and Wiseman from page 134 of the book. We've been talking about a woman named Dahlia, and you say that, like Dahlia, many women don't need their boyfriends and husbands to simply defer to their judgments and acquiesce to their choices. They want something more. Real partners with whom they can be mutually forthright about their own desires and conflicts, and with whom they can hope to achieve clarity together. And that was really striking to me, because I think that's the case actually about a lot of things that concern like reproductive health. Sometimes men that are in relationships with women think it's an act of generosity to be like, I'll do whatever you want. But that's actually not an act of generosity. It's putting more pressure on the women. So I guess it would be curious to hear you say, like, what messages might you have for men who are in relationships with women who are ambivalent, and, you know, where the men might also be ambivalent about having children.
Listen up, boys. Well, first of all, it's wonderful to hear that resonated with you, because that was definitely one of the, again, something that's a question of how to walk this really fine line. We want, for ourselves as women, relationships where men respect the unequal burdens that motherhood and parenting can still put on women. We want them to be able to accept our veto rights over our own body. However, as you were picking up on, the idea that therefore they are left completely off the hook, and in fact are doing something virtuous by, as we say, you know, answering the question, should we have children? Whatever you want, honey, that is a problem. We don't want people... I say this, and ever since the book came out, some people be like, I do want this. But a lot of people do not want the answer, whatever you want, honey. To hear that when we're trying to figure out what to have for dinner or what we want to watch, let alone when we're asking the question, do you want to have a child with me? And when we're talking about how part of the difficulty of making this choice is that it is anxiety provoking, is that we fear isolation. This is only making that worse. As advice for men, I mean, always a good place to start is to ask one's partner, what would be helpful to you? So reading the book and assuming, I heard that what you really want me to do is this, well, ask her. I think creating that space as early in a relationship as possible for women, not just say what they want, think through what they want. Who says they know what they want? We heard so many stories of people feeling like they have to go through years of relationship before even raising the question, meaning that they have become so committed in it. They are now fallen in love with this person. They built a whole life around this person, only to find out that they may not be on the same page where family comes. That could be very difficult. And one of the reasons that happens is that women feel like they cannot raise that question too early, lest they come off, and as the cliche goes, as desperate and needy. So how do we make room for a person to raise that early on? And then within a relationship, I think philosophically I'm very interested in this. So, you know, the possibility of expressing a desire without that in itself being oppressive or coercive. How do we thread that needle so that we have room for men to think through this, express their ambivalence, even express their desire, while, again, maintaining that non-coercive, non-oppressive stance. I will say that it was remarkable how many men answered our question of, you know, would you raise this? What happens when you raise this? Says, I would never raise this. I would feel creepy. I would feel controlling. I would feel kind of aggressive. And we thought, well, something is going wrong here, because we see, on the other hand, all these women standing on the other side of that divide going, why am I completely alone in this life-defining decision?
Okay, well, this is a book for people of all genders. Indeed. But given this last answer, perhaps recommend it to your men friends specifically. And if you are a man, consider getting it. But yeah, so thank you so much for your time. I mean, I just feel like this kind of public-facing philosophy is such a gift in our culture. And you've given us so much food for thought. So hopefully you all enjoyed this video, and check out the book. Thanks, Anastasia.
Thanks for having me.